Hi, I'm Matthew Kelly, and welcome to Profoundly Human. About once a year, I walk into a room with the leaders of various organizations that I lead, that I own, that I've founded, and I say to those leaders, you have got to read this book. It happens about once a year, and last year it was this book. The book is called Wanting. The author is Luke Burgis. He's with me today. It is an absolutely phenomenal book. It will blow your mind in every aspect of your life. You pick any aspect of your life and read it. Read this book through the lens of that aspect of your life, and it will change the way you think about that aspect of your life. Luke, welcome. Honored to have you.
Matthew, thanks for the very kind words. It's an honor to be here. And I remember reading Rediscover Catholicism in 2008, and that was that book for me that year.
Wow, I appreciate that. So wanting, we want all the time, and we think a lot about what we want, but what is very clear from the book is that we know so very little about why we want what we want. I guess the first question I have for you is, in its simplest form, why do we want what we want?
According to the thinker that changed my life, Rene Girard, who inspired my book, we want things due to a social process because we're social creatures. You know, we're not these independent, completely autonomous beings that we often like to think we are, where we generate our desires out of nothing. You know, we're profoundly dependent on God, of course, and dependent on other people for even our very desires, even the things that we want. And Girard's key insight into human nature and human behavior is that human desire is fundamentally imitative, or mimetic. Mimetic is a bit of a fancier word to refer to a specific kind of imitation, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. So that our desires are formed through other people who act as models of desire for us. And this was a profound insight for me. You know, normally we think of imitation on a surface level. We think of imitating languages and customs and dress and things like this. We don't often think that human imitation goes down to the profound level of desire, so that the people that I'm around are actually influencing what I want, which means it's really important, far more important than we even realize, to be around people that want the things that we want to want, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the things that are really worth wanting, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
But most people, I think at first blush, would find a concept somewhere on the spectrum of offensive, from mildly offensive to very offensive, because we think our desires are so unique. We think our desires is one of the forums where we express real independence. Do you come up against that when you're having conversations with people? Do people push back on what you've just said and said, no, I mean, I'm a fiercely independent person. I want what I want because I want it, and it is not influenced by all these other things?
Oh, there's massive psychological blocks up to this concept. I mean, I encounter fierce resistance, even in myself. You know, that was my first reaction when I discovered this idea from Rene Girard, who's a very serious, devout Catholic, by the way, was resistance. And there's a certain level of, I think, humility required, first of all, to sort of understand that, you know, from the time I was a baby, you know, I was completely reliant on my parents, and, you know, so totally dependent, and assimilating things I didn't even realize, you know, unconsciously, about what's worthy of, you know, looking at and pursuit. And but there's a funny thing: as children are open imitators, and they're often proud to imitate. You know, they're not ashamed of their imitation. You know, they'll imitate mom or dad and look what I can do, and do the same thing. But something very strange happens as we grow up. You know, usually around the time of adolescence, we sort of enter this world where imitation becomes a bad thing, becomes associated with some loss of our autonomy or something like that. And that's where imitation turns into mimesis, and mimesis sort of connoting a hidden form of imitation where we're constantly trying to hide our own reliance on other people and dependence on other people, even our dependence on God, and try to assert our own autonomy and think of our desires as entirely generated by myself. Like nobody in the history of the world has ever wanted the same thing that Luke Burgis wants, and it's sort of this flattering of self-sufficiency. And this idea does not mean that our desires are not unique to us. It just means that they go through a process of formation that is social, and I can come out of that process due to my concrete circumstances, my family, the city I live in, all different kinds of things mean that my desires manifest themselves in very specific ways that are very unique to me. But that doesn't mean that they're not formed through this social process. So it's a bit of a both and, right? Where we can come to want a relationship that is very specific to us, right? I mean, desire, even my relationship with God, right? It's a very personal one. But there's also a lot in there that comes through decades. I mean, if we step back and think of, the church, hundreds and thousands of years of formation of desire that's happened that helps point the way, to what is worthy to want, all the saints. And we could go on and on about this, right? And I somehow enter into the stream of desire as a person, right? As an individual. And it's a bit of both and. I'm highly formed by it, and I somehow have to make it my own at the same time.
You talked about the psychological aspect of the concept. Is it a psychological concept? It's impacting history, it's impacting economics, impacting what we buy for lunch and who we're romantically attracted to potentially. Do you think of it first as a psychological concept, or do you think of it in some other way?
I think of it as fundamentally a spiritual concept. I think of desire as something profoundly spiritual and mysterious. And there are three layers and levels to which people think of this idea of mimetic desire. The first is a purely material level. We have mirror neurons in our brains, actually, where if we see somebody else doing something like eating an ice cream cone, we literally have neurons firing in our brain as if we were eating an ice cream cone. They're called mirror neurons. And that provides some kind of a physical basis for this power of imitation that we have. There's a psychological aspect to this, where this is, just psychology. But psychology is a funny thing. Psychology kind of bleeds into the spiritual, right? And I often sometimes wonder if when we're talking about psychology, we're often talking about the spiritual, right? Maybe even theology. So for me, desire is something profoundly spiritual, kind of rooted in St. Augustine's, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And he's talking about desire, right? The deepest desires of our hearts. And that's why, this whole idea is very Augustinian in that sense. Like our desires are infinite, and they're always looking for something to rest in, and they can go off in a million different directions on the horizontal plane, right? Can always find something to satisfy our desires in consumerism, all different kinds of things. But ultimately, our desires are, what are they pointing us towards? And that's where there's there's a lot of spiritual theology, I think, that's left unexplored in René Girard. Because for me, the reason this was such an important thing for me to learn is because it profoundly changed my spiritual life.